Hello, this is the podcast from the international research platform SIMM, with reports and interviews from across the world on the role music can play in social and community programs. I am Lucas Perron. Hello, Katie Milliken.
Hello, Lucas.
So good that we can talk after we were together in this research seminar of SIMM at the Guildhall School in London on the topic of what the role of composers and composition in general can be in participatory music practice. Maybe we can start with the notion of participatory music practice. What you, as a composer developing projects in this field, what does that mean to you? Participatory. What is so participatory about music practice being called like that?
Well, I think we know that in a situation where music is being performed and people are listening, there's a very special type of interaction between performer and listener. But when we're moving on from there and talking about listeners actually taking a larger role in the whole conception of the event or the carrying out of the performance, then there are many, many ways that audience can be involved. And, the question is, why would you have participation, when we've had this sort of age-old way of performing music to others. But it certainly does, when you've got some sort of performance where there are 100 performers, each with a handbell, and where the motions are not particularly complex, but in fact the result is rather amazing, and you as a participator can be actually involved in the actual making. That's a very different experience for participators or a participating audience. I think it's not for everyone. I think it should never be by coercion. I think that there are some people who are very happily extreme listeners and really just want to listen. But it can happen in so many, many ways and on many different levels, I think.
When we hear about participatory practice, we tend to think of social and community music projects. No? No, I do. You don't?
Yes. No, I think that when people are playing music together and it's for an evening and they've simply just playing together for the enjoyment, that's a musical event. But, everyone's participating, yes. But when it's a presentational type of participation, and I think Thomas Torino does make that differentiation, then it's a participation which actually leads to a performance and which leads to a making of something or a revealing of something.
Yes, but in the context of the type of practice that we're looking at through the SIMM network of researchers and scholars, we do look at social and community music projects in which indeed parts of our population are participating who are not there as musicians, as professional musicians, or preparing themselves to be professional musicians.
Yes, that's an interesting point, Lucas, because there are various terminologies that we're using. But in fact, when you do bring people together to actually make an event, you give them instructions, they have an instrument, they are acting as musicians, albeit non-musicians without any experience. But in fact, in that sense, it does create a social situation, and it is I think the one doesn't preclude the other. I think one can perhaps take on board the fact that a situation can have absolutely vital social implications, and at the same time, if it is a presentational participatory event, presenting something that is very beautiful for people who might also just want to listen. So that's what I'm meaning, that participatory music can be on all levels, in many different spheres and lines of continuation.
You have been in two positions in this field as a composer, developing participatory music projects, community music projects, as well as a researcher. Can you tell us a little bit about and your practice and your research?
Yes. Over the last years, I've been involved in many different types of projects that involve people who are not necessarily musicians. It's sometimes in cross-disciplinary types of projects, or sometimes concentrating purely on music. And they too have also had different uses, different reasons, different raison d'être, and different ways of being carried out. Just switching back to the question before, I can give an example of what I mean. In Japan, I was in the area that had been hit very badly by tsunami, in the Kamaishi area, which is north of, it's definitely north of Tokyo, but it's in the Iwate prefecture, and north of Fukushima. And there we did a project with wind band students on the beach and standing in a circle, and they were playing elements of a composition which made a type of musical installation that changed as the sun went down. And for these students, this was the first time they'd been back to the sea, the first time they were beside the sea. So they were sort of playing to the ocean, if you will. Now, that had a very big social impact, because people from the immediate area that had been hit very badly by the tsunami were able to come down and be part of this event. And it had a very healing element to it. But at the same time, it was definitely a performance. It had a certain starting time, it had listeners, and it had participators who were forming the event. Then we had local people then join the circle and give messages, and that made a performance event, and there were still people listening to it. So as I was saying before, what formed part of my research was actually to try and find a way of describing, and a way of appreciating, and a way of differentiating between, as a composer, between events that are more participatory, less participatory, events that more of my compositional input, and to see actually, amongst these myriad ways of carrying out participatory events, what are their differences, what are their similarities?
What are the skills that you yourself as a composer really needed to make things work in this example of participatory practice project?
Yes, that was a very much a listening and playing project, and I simply had to give the instructions. It's a type of John Cage piece where the entries by everyone is based upon certain instructions, but it was also allowed for a pretty large area of free decision-making upon the part of the participants as to when they play.
Were there many things fixed at a certain point, or?
Yes, there was a series of pitches that they could choose from. There was a timekeeper who showed the time, and they had to give various entries in different lengths of notes, which they could decide themselves. Mm-hmm. But within a certain time, they had to play a certain amount of entries. They had to enter a certain amount of times into that time circle, so to speak, and be present. And this meant that, sometimes there'd be just short notes, but it meant that other times there were quite complex chords that were being sounded at the same time.
Yes. So performances could be of this same piece, as it were, could be very different.
That's right. But it still could be performed by another group in another part of the world. There were other projects that were part of my research, which spanned more educational areas. And the social aspect, I think, was probably with almost everyone. I couldn't think of a project that didn't have a social component, sometimes much more, sometimes, on a rather lower level. But each of the projects really varied quite dramatically in their makeup, in their construction. And that was also part of my interest, to find out best practice as a composer in carrying out such varied types of participatory projects.
In a previous podcast episode of the SIMM-podcast, you already presented shortly the project that you developed in Hamburg, involving a mixture of professional musicians and musicians of different genres and non-musicians as well. So you've been involved in a variety of very different types of participatory projects.
That's correct. And I think that was the most interesting thing for me in the research, was to catalogue what sort of input by me as a composer, what was needed, and how the type of leading or ways of leading that I not only developed, but that I also developed in discussion with others, could actually lead to a better participatory experience or a better social experience.
Could you say a few words about your research and make us curious to read it?
Yes, well, the first part of the research is, in fact, picking apart the situation where you are together with participants who are curious, eager to find out what they'll be doing, perhaps a little bit tentative, a little bit nervous. And how do I, as a composer, invite them into that sphere, into that room of making something together, making sound together? How can I best do that? But on the same hand, keep a very light touch as a leader. Various others have called it a more interactive approach, or a collaborative approach, or some call it first, second, or third way. And I think that if you enter a type of participatory process where too many factors are too open, generally the projects or the time spent together is time-based. So you also want to deepen the experience. And if it stays too much on the level of deciding what we're going to do, you're going to lose a lot of valuable experiential time in how we're going to do it or how we're going to develop it. So I do come in with a blueprint of action, and I enlarge upon this in the beginning of the thesis. So the first and second chapter really do talk about the intricacies and the nitty-gritty of setting up not only a project, what's a project, but setting up an experiential space that is certainly time-based, but that is definitely sound-based and definitely based on input and discussion and collaboration with the participating people. Then there are 2 or 3 more chapters based around the projects that I have made, picking them apart, what was perhaps what I considered successful and why, what was difficult. I think everyone who has carried out participatory projects will agree that, or in any sphere of learning or education or creation, collaboration, does need to be managed, or it does need to have particular rules. Enough time is one of them. Equality and inclusion. Everyone has a say. Democracy. So I've looked at the various projects where perhaps that wasn't always possible to carry out the collaboration or the democracy to agree that I would have wished. So yes, there's a lot of sort of close looking at the projects, and I think anyone who is interested to see how other people carry these out, they will find in my thesis various ways and various strategies for carrying things out or working together. And then at the last chapter is a balance, or a really checking through a checklist of what the synthesis of knowledge that I've gleaned from carrying out this research.
I imagine that it's not easy to do research on your own practice and to take the sufficient distance from it. Did you work in a team? Did you work with others who could help you with looking with a minimum of distance to your own practice?
Well, because the research was about how to improve my practice, it certainly was important for me to develop strategies about how I would rate it, or the salient points to look at, because I was also trying to categorize different projects and how they're carried out. That could only be done by me. But the other one, the first area of actually looking at my practice, was obviously very much to do with my two supervisors, who were very versed in this area, as well as I carried out interviews with people whose work, I've always really admired. And I was able to include their findings and match them with mine, so that was a sort of a viewpoint that I could keep going back to test the waters, so to speak.
I would like to also reflect together with you a little bit about something which is an important element coming back in participatory practice, music practice, is the element of co-creation, that at the musical level, music can often be co-created with the participants. And so I guess that this asks very specific talents from a composer, if a composer is part of the project. Can you share some of your ideas and experiences in that, in relation to strategies for composing together and decentralize decisions concerning which music to co-create and how?
Yes, I think that's a very interesting point. Certainly, co-creating music is not a new thing. In many other spheres, in architectural offices, there are very many people will be creating a building together, or scientists are working together on various things where it's needing an input from everybody.
Yeah, urbanism and urbanistic projects and
That's right. So it depends on the group of people that you're with. You might be with a group of people with skill sets that are very different. And it's
like the choirs, for example, the choir project that you did.
I'm thinking more of sort of more ad hoc participatory projects where you, for example, the Hamburg one, where it was advertised and people could say, yes, I want to do this, and they, you talk to them and worked out which part they'd be involved in. But there was one part for people with no music at all and who really didn't want to be creating music, and they wanted to create texts. And in those workshops, there we had architects and we had teachers and we had housewives and housemen. We had students, we had some school students, we had some math people who were really interested to get their language skills working again. So in that sort of area, it is very exciting because everyone can add knowledge and add ideas coming from their particular viewpoint. It gets quite colourful. If you've got a room full of school teachers, it's equally as colourful, but it gets very particular. And that's a completely different type of working together. The Hamburg project that we were talking about, there were musicians, hobby musicians that applied to do this. And there were also various groups of musicians that all already played in a group, like the oud group, the choir group, but there were also just single musicians who came in saying, "Look, I occasionally play a tambourine. Do you think I can partake?" So also there, it's very important to abide by and impart the rules of, that you need time for decision making and discussion, that you need to let everyone have their voice, that there needs to be a type of generosity and collegiality. And there's also that thing of explaining how excited it can become, and that, when you're discussing things, that it's quite important to, when you get excited about things and ideas are thrown out and someone say yes, but, and then there's already a change to the idea. That's where I remind the group that we actually need to try out not only every idea, but every variation of an idea, and that we need to find and need to impart a way of actually saying, okay, look, the next 10 minutes we're going to collect ideas. Everyone has to remember what their particular idea was. Certainly you can add on to ideas that someone else has said, but we will try all ideas in all formats. And in 10 minutes, we're going to stop taking suggestions and we're going to try them out now. And then we're going to talk about which ones we want to pursue and why. And then it's also important to let people down gently if their idea wasn't taken, and to show reasons why the group has decided on a particular thing and why that might be best. And it is also my role as a composer to advise them if they're going on a route that is actually going to probably be a dead end. I can warn them.
As we're talking about music projects, when there's a composer in the project, I imagine that people expect the composer to take a directing role, no? Or like in theater, you have a theater director. But in participatory music projects, one hears the composer being a facilitator. And is this just a game of words? Or what I'm looking at is, well, what is also a bit of the power position that a composer can, should, or shouldn't be in music project. If you're presented as the composer of the music project, then it corresponds to certain things that they will expect from you, no?
When you do a participatory project and it is going to be presented, underlining presented, then many qualities of the composer, leader, musician are needed, because there's not only the area of development of musical material, but you're also rehearsing then the group. You're actually making the group into a performance group. And I think, those two areas of development and then rehearsal are very important for a presentational participatory work. For the developmental part, it certainly is so that everything that the composer does towards leading the project has an immediate effect upon actually what the end performance is going to be like. Simply because if you introduce too much material, it's not any then a co-creation. If that's what you've promised, and it has to do with what you're promising, if you haven't matched the amount of time needed, plus taking into account how many people are taking part, plus the type of spaces that you can rehearse in, that have you got breakout spaces or not? Have you got ample opportunity for people to really break off in small groups, develop and come back to a large group? All sorts of things. Everything that you do there contributes to the inherent organic quality of the piece and smooth development of a piece. So for the development of material, as I was saying, it is
Yes.
very important that you don't bring too many ideas so that people are swamped, that you still bring enough background information or beginning models that people can use or become excited and create their own from. It is also then important that a composer leader during the rehearsal period can use knowledge of arrangement to actually perhaps help for a better sound or a more cohesive result. But it's often then really down to real rehearsal leader stuff, like this is what giving an entry looks like to conduct, and would one of you like to, it's teaching them to conduct, all that sort of thing. So as a composer leader, you are responsible for the whole thing, for the whole event. So the first part, the co-creation, yes, there's an immense amount of thought that goes into not only the musical material, the amount of musical material, what sort of musical material, what sort of musical exercises do you bring to prepare the group, to get them into a musical way of thinking. If they just come off the street and you say, make up a tune, that's not going to happen. You want, well, it might, on a good day, but you'll find in theatre improvisations, there's lots of, for example, Peter Brook exercises that are sort of there to get that magical moment of the mind not forcing creation, but of it actually just flowing in the moment. So there's lots of things that are involved in participatory music making that means that a composer has to learn new skills, as well as knowing which skills as a composer to use at what time. And I'm a bit bemused by the term facilitator. I sometimes wonder if it's so that a composer can't say this was a co-creation and I did 50% or 40% and then they have to pay rights. I'm not sure. When someone's leading a project, there is always a sense of authorship, and that should be clear from the beginning of the project. So
that's not simple.
The word facilitator, I think, is just for a one-off workshop where you just come in and have a nice musical time. But otherwise, if it goes further, then there is obviously a composer input.
Another question. During the research seminar we organized in London, there was talk about the fact that participatory music projects could maybe lead to a future form of music. Is this something exaggerated, or is this something that you do recognize?
So is this a new format? I think it's actually already there, Lucas. It's certainly there in other art forms. In visual arts, there's been, in Latin countries and South American countries, there's a great tradition of participatory artist projects. And certainly, if you read that wonderful book by Claire Bishop called Participation, she elicits and details wonderful, different sorts of visual arts projects. So I think it's there. I think music has been slower because it is simply bound by a lot of craft that it entails. And I think also a lot of simply has to do with the music industry, how much of an industry it is, a commercial industry, and it hasn't allowed the prospect of other criteria for listening or participating. It hasn't allowed that to be part of the musical landscape.
Do you have the impression that more and more composers are attracted to this work, this participatory music field?
I think definitely that there's been a great loosening even of what the term composition means. It's not now particularly on paper. It can encompass improvisation, and it might indeed be electronic composition with through electronic or digital means, and participation can therefore happen on many levels. And then composers are sometimes needing participants to carry out, spatial works, for example, sound spatial works. So, all of the topics, what is contemporary music, what is participatory work, what is sound art, it's all sort of coming under one rather large umbrella.
Yes. Thank you so much, Katie. Michał Kawecki. He's a doctoral researcher and member of the research department of the Guildhall School of Music and Drama in London. And he recently attended and participated in SIMM research seminar on the topic that we're discussing here, which is the role that composers may have within participatory music projects. Welcome, Michał.
Thank you so much for your invitation.
My first question is, what do you understand with participatory music projects?
So I think in my understanding, especially through the prism of my creative practice, it's some kind of artistic activity which involves people not necessarily from the academia, not necessarily people who are professionally trained. It's a sense of creative projects which are producing a sense of community. So I think sometimes as well in that kind of activities, there is no focus on the final product. It's more about the gathering and exchanging and socializing with different people from different environments. So in my case, I found it really helpful and very unusual since I moved to London that, let's say, professionally trained composers, performers like vocalists and pianists, they can gather with people who are absolutely amateur, and they are supporting them in the socializing process. And for my creative practice, it's as well about talking about someone else's lived experiences, talking about amplifying voices of people who are underrepresented and marginalized.
You say that it's related to your coming to London. Does that mean that you have the impression that this practice is more developed in London and the UK than in your country, in Poland?
I think so, but I cannot state it 100% because I haven't done any research in my country of origin. But when I was a student at the Academy of Music in Lodz,
yes,
I've never come across of that kind of activities. I know that was very familiar for music therapy, but that was from the different angle. The another angle of that participatory aspect is that Guildhall School is pretty unusual conservatoire. So I think that's very unusual for what I'm calling conservative conservatoire, which are structured on the very traditional model, which are focused on very technical stuff and very highly intellectual outcome of every single creative practice which is undertaken within the institution.
Yes, so the Guildhall School is has a larger interest, let's say, in what artists can develop, also in terms of their engagement towards society or their place in society. But Michał, so you are yourself, as a practitioner, developing participatory music projects. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So I haven't developed my own, and I'm just in the phase of preparation for that, for the final stage of my doctorate. But I was participating twice in a very beautiful project developed at Guildhall by Gavin Roberts and Rebecca Cohen called Creative Minds in Song.
And you participated as a composer?
I participated as a composer twice. And that's a project which is established in a collaboration between Guildhall School, Mind Foundation, and as well the Song in the City Foundation. And it's a project which is bringing up together Guildhall composers, vocalists, pianists, and people who are trustees, but not necessarily mentees of Mind. There are people who experienced some mental health issues And this project is aimed to give them the space to talk about it, and not necessarily only about it. So people who are coming from Mind, they are so-called writers, but they don't like these words. Most of them, they don't like this to be pronounced writers.
And Minds, that's this organization called Minds, yes.
Yeah, the Mind is the international organization originated from Germany, which is an organization working in the field of mental health support and mental health and well-being awareness.
Okay.
What as well is unusual about this project is that it's very, comparing it to the other participatory project, it's a very long-term project, which takes at least 6 months, 5-6 months.
And you were yourself also involved in a long period. It allowed you to also get to know the participants?
Yes, exactly. So I took in the project twice, I took part twice, and that was constructed from weekly meetings, which were around an hour and a half, 2 hours sometimes, where we had the chance to meet each other before the phase of collaboration, before the phase of writing pieces and performing, which I found that allowed me to establish a very profound collaborative bonds and as well to understand what is someone else's background and story.
And what was expected from you? What was your role? What was your work within the project?
So as the name of the project is Creative Minds in Songs, the aim of the project is to produce the collective concert of songs, which are not necessarily designated for piano and voice, but most of the pieces are written for piano and voice. So there's a freedom for, let's say, a small chamber instrumentation, but most of the pieces were written for voice and piano.
So you wrote pieces and you inspired yourself on material that was given by the participants, content material, or even also musical material. Tell us a bit about this.
So that's interesting. In my case, the process of writing, because I was working with, which is as well very exciting, throughout the project, I was working with 2 writers. One writer is called Isabel Lane, and she is a classically trained soprano who graduated from Royal Academy of Music. Royal College of Music. Due to her experiences with a depression, she stopped singing for 18 years, if I'm right. She's now returning to singing. And in her poetry, she was writing about her experiences connected with abandoning her singing career, which was something which she loved and she was very successful touring around Europe. So the piece, the poem was called My Child Died, which was about an internal child as this operatic career. So definitely the content of the text and the poetry greatly informed my music, which was very unusual for me because I think that was the first time in my life when I was really collaborating with someone, with a poet who was sharing their lived experience about something which was not abstract.
Not necessarily easy, I imagine.
Oh yeah, definitely. And as well, the creative process was quite difficult in terms, like for me, because I found that it takes so slow to set someone else lived experience to give this authentic, which is important for me, authentic representation of their story. It's not my reinterpretation. I am adding, I would say, this musical added value, which is enriching the poetry, which I believe. So the poetry is the first and the most important part of this project. And throughout this collaboration, of course, we are doing some changes in the poetry, the minor changes, some words which they were working well within the musical phrase.
Yes.
But I was always very close with my poets to make sure that they're happy with the outcome, to make sure that they're happy with the sound word, to make sure that I squeezed everything which I could to authentically represent their story.
During the research seminar where you participated in London, you were the one who was telling us that maybe this type of work may also bring about new types of music. What can that mean?
So I think that the participatory project, but that's only my statement, is a sign of times where, especially in the academic background, where not the most important thing is about how, let's say, eloquent or intelligent or innovative the score is, how many extended techniques we used in a score.
Yes.
The music is going to the direction where it's undertaking an open discourse with socially engaged topics and with the political issues. So I believe that the participatory project is something about, is escape from artistic fiction. And of course, in my opinion, artistic fiction is something beautiful as well. But it's something which is giving an authentic expression of our modern times.
Yes.
So it's not something which is aimed to very limited elite of people enclosed within the boundary of a music conservatoire. It's more aimed for the broader society. For everyone, it's more communal, but as well, it's talking about more actual topics. It's not talking about aesthetics. It's not interested in a discourse of techniques and score by itself. It's more about this emotional music expression and the relation with audience.
But then this will need composers to embrace very different skills, no?
Of course, I think that many composers, most of us probably are coming from traditional backgrounds. We got used to be enclosed and locked down in our room, working for hours, producing the score and handing it over to the performers, which I think that participatory projects is the opposite of that. There is not really, I don't think so, there's a good to lock down yourself and close within the score. I think that the score, even if the composer is taking the role of writing music, this is collaboratively created.
And what were the skills that you needed to make things work? Beside this one example that you just gave of the singer, maybe other examples during your experience working as a composer in participatory projects. What were other skills that you would need? You needed or you missed during the work?
So I think that definitely the social skills are very important, that you need to be a very good listener. At the same time, you need to understand. So you need to create a very kind of like a very thoughtful dialogue with your collaborators, because they are, some of them, they are not professional trained musicians. They don't know too much about your world, but you're going to work with them together. And they kind of expect as well that they will be satisfied with the final product. So I think as well, which not necessarily participatory projects are aimed for, creative, a beautiful, 100% perfect final product. And I feel that as well, what was different comparing to other projects when I was working on concert music, that you need to put your expectations down, you need to put it on a side. And I actually was very happy with my final outcome. And I was very amazed what was at the end. But throughout the process, you need to be very careful as well with every single word which you are saying. And at the end of this final process, I feel, and that's as well my statement, that every single note can heal and every single note can hurt. So, of course, I'm talking about in the context of working with lived experience and the projects which are undertook over the last few years.
Can one say or hope or expect that such participatory collaborative work of composing songs and music leads to richer results? Or and because you just say that also you had to somehow take this risk that the final result would not be poorer than when you would be on your own in your room writing it all together. Can you say something about that? The final musical results. Imagine you can't talk about this in general.
That's a really good question. Actually, I think that I can share some interesting thoughts about it. So, yeah, that's interesting because I said one thing and then now I'm going to say something which will be a contradiction, because I used to, for years...
It's not a problem to contradict oneself.
For years, I was, like within this framework of, let's say, music school and then music conservatoire, I used to be aimed for, I don't know, like win prizes, the competitions, to write the piece which will be the best piece which I can write in that time of my life, which is of course impossible, but they were expectations. So coming from that background and moving to London, to coming to different environment without this expectation was something new for me. So I think that the participatory projects are putting these expectations on hold, and they are never revealed until to the final performance. But at the same time, I found that these pieces which I created with my collaborators were one of the most powerful emotionally. And I'm talking about only my personal satisfaction. I'm not talking about what was the reaction of audience, because that's a thing which is very hard to measure as well. I'll just briefly introduce these two projects. So one was the My Child Died, and then 1 year later, or 2 years later, the piece called My Child Fell, which was as well written by Isabel after almost 30 years from the poem My Child. What was as well very powerful, which I experienced very powerful within working within the creative minds in songs, is that for the first time in my life, during the piece which I was co-creating with my collaborators, people who were sharing their lived experience, their voices were in the music and on the stage. So in relating to pieces created with
voices in terms of their stories, but also you could hear their voices because they were talking or singing?
From both sides.
Yes.
So in the pieces created with Isabel,
yes.
Isabel had spoken phrases throughout the piece.
Yes.
So there was a vocalist who was singing, had the single parts, and Isabel was reciting, which I found very powerful, that you can see the author and hear their voice.
Michał, in collaborative co-creative composition, there's the question of authorship. In the more traditional classical way of working, the authorship goes to the writer and the composer, especially the composer. But this is not necessarily so simple or evident in collaborative work like in participatory music projects. What are your thoughts and experiences at that level?
So that's absolutely, I would say it's quite problematic topic in terms of, especially about talking about the authorship of the pieces which they have more authors than two. Because quite often in the European law, in many European countries, we are sharing, let's say, authorship, let's say, as realities, as 50% going to composers, 50% going to writers. How about when we've got two writers? How about if the piece is created by the whole group of people? I think that definitely the participatory projects are distinguished by that field, that they are having more authors, they are more multifaceted. They are not only created by one person. They are not only written in collaboration between two people. So that's the one thing. And another thing is, which if we would think about it further, if I'm having, let's say, consultation with the writer about the music, if they like the words, if they like the phrase, vocal line, which I said, if they like the sound word or no, if they are giving me some advices at the same time, shall I credit them within that process, within my music as well? It's getting very problematic when we are talking about, academia, creating doctoral submissions, having all of these consents where sometimes they're expected, like academia is expecting from us to create your original piece without too many authors in music, for instance. But I definitely believe that it might be problematic. I think it's well the advantage of a participatory project. And in my own personal experience, I believe that it's given me a very special additional value, which I would never have in the traditional way of working with, even in a collaboration with other writers, because the participatory projects are bringing something more in terms of subject matter, because it's quite often about the lived experience, it's quite often about the participants.
Thank you so much. Fiona Evison, hello.
Hello.
you're a composer and you're very involved also in participatory music projects. And first of all, I would like to talk with you about your position as a composer within community music projects. And within the experience that you have, could you tell us about the specific skills that you think that composers need to be able to do this work well?
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly when you are working with a wide variety of participants, age, it could be age related or sort of, I use the word skill, but just their experience in music making, then as a composer, you need to, first of all, have the sort of musical skills and also the social skill to be able to work with a wide variety of people. Sometimes they may have sort of inhibitions about the idea of creating music, thinking that they are not able to do it. You know, I often encounter that where people say, "Oh, I'm not creative. You know, that's for the composer to do," and feeling that they don't have much to offer, which is not true at all. So
the composer having these magical skills to bring it into composing and compositional writing. Yes,
that's right. Yeah, I mean, I think they have an idea of what a composer is, and what composing is, this sort of mysterious process. But if you can break that down into small steps that are achievable, and then work towards the end goal, then that's certainly been a way that I've found has worked well.
And what is interesting, what is in it for you as a composer? I mean, as your work.
Oh, well, I love to work.
In terms of your compositional work.
Mm-hmm. Well, so the interesting thing is that you get to hear people's thoughts, and they are often really different. There's a lot of fresh thinking there.
What is fresh thinking?
Fresh. Yeah.
Fresh.
So, you know,
in which sense?
When you're working with children, especially, mm-hmm. they have a unique way of looking at the world, of expressing their thinking about the world. And it's just really delightful to be able to walk with them along that process of getting those thoughts into musical form. Being able to work with people in the community, that's really quite different from working with professional musicians.
And how do you learn this then?
How do you learn this? That's a good question. I've just sort of learned it from experience, and then from talking to other composers who are doing this kind of work, and learning from their example.
You've been in touch with a number of composers developing or trying to develop this work, this participatory social and community music projects.
Yeah. Starting in about 2019, I did a research with about 33 different participants who were either doing this work or had worked with composers who were working this way. And I've been able to maintain some of those connections over the years as well. And so have ongoing conversations about these topics, about how to work in the community.
And so when you think back on the contacts that you had with, and you still have with composers developing work in this field, what is coming up as like main skills, talents needed, or also difficulties that they experience within this work?
Right. Well, certainly, the musical skill is one thing.
Yes.
Being able to address that, but then also the social.
Yes.
Working with a group, sort of making sure that not one person dominates the process, having those kind of group dynamic skills. Depending on who you have in your project, there might be age differences. So I recently did a project with adults and children. So then you have to kind of navigate between the two age groups. I did a project where there was a professional choir and children from the community. So working with different sort of understandings about what music is and how to express that. That was another thing. Of course, there are composers who work in settings where the participants have experienced trauma. Mm-hmm. And so those composers would really benefit from having some kind of trauma, therapy, trauma-informed practice, having some specialized training around those issues.
Or the possibility to work together with people who have this.
Really. Yeah. Some of those situations are so, you have to be so careful not to cause further damage.
And in this work, one often hears about music that has been co-created. So in collaboration with participants who may have musical talents and capacities and the capacity of mastering certain instruments, but also participants who do not have this, but who have connections with certain forms of music. And so can you share some experience, your personal experience, or maybe of composers that you've been in contact with?
Right. Well, in my personal experience, often work with vocal music making. So if a participant doesn't have necessarily the musical experience, they can still create lyrics.
Okay.
And those lyrics can be a really important and, pivotal part of the process. So you can work with people on text creation. And, if you are doing a choral piece or something involving the voice, those lyrics they are really, really important. So that is one way that people who may be unsure about their musical contribution, they can still be a very important part of the process by creating lyrics.
How much time do you need to be able to do this well?
That depends on the project and what the end goal is. So one thing that I've been finding is that people actually do care about the finished product.
Yes.
They want that to be something that they feel proud of. Oftentimes that will be presented publicly in some way. Mm-hmm. And they just have a sense of wanting there to be an outcome that they feel good about presenting. Mm-hmm. So sometimes, you sometimes hear in the field, well, the process is more important than the product. Mm. I don't think it's that simple. I think it's both.
Yes.
I think the the end result does matter. People get so much feeling of self-worth from being proud of presenting something. So if that is the goal, then that requires more time than if you're only looking at the process of co-creation.
Yes.
Or because you need time to learn and to polish. And
Fiona, I would like to hear you say something about when you're in a position, you yourself as a composer, in a position where you collaborate with participants and get to a final result, which, as you said, is important also to show. And this gives good feelings about for those participating, and not only for yourself, but also for all those participating. But the question is then, whose work is this? If it's a collaborative process, it means that it's co-created. It's not only you as a composer or a librettist, a writer who has created this, but it's multiple people have been collaborating in this. And how do you deal with authorship and also, yes, somehow the power positions that you or others may have within that process? Can you say something about this?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, I have no problem with sharing authorship. For me, that's not an issue at all. And for instance, in my recent research, we co-created 4 pieces of choral music.
Yes.
On the scores, we listed all the names of the participants.
Yes. Okay.
So that's one way, is just to acknowledge in writing.
Clarify, really.
To clarify. So when we presented it publicly, we talked about the process.
Yes.
It was very clear. The participants had an opportunity to share what they had learned,
Yes.
what they were most excited about in the music. So there are ways to verbally and in writing discuss these issues.
Mm-hmm.
My ego is not involved. I consider myself more in a position of serving people through leadership. And I have no issue with co-authoring or and talking about it. The other thing that happens is that composers who are working collaboratively sometimes choose not to call themselves a composer.
Why is that?
And they use other terminology,
Yes.
like facilitator.
Uh-huh.
Well, they're trying to avoid all the cultural connotations around the term composer. But if we don't use the word, then how will we know that the practice has shifted in a lot of cases? If we never call it composing, if we only call it facilitating or something else, right? Then how will we know that composing has actually in some, many cases become a more of a social practice?
Yes, of course. Composers these days, for some time already, have been used to collaborate with professional musicians and ensembles, not writing, composing, imagining their piece entirely in solitude in their room, but collaborating very closely with those who will be creating this music. But of course, this is something quite different from working with people who are not professional musicians. And in your view, what is so different between those two type of experiences that you can have as a composer?
It actually depends on the professional musicians too. Sometimes they are very reluctant to be a part of the creative process. It depends on how they have been used to thinking. And, I've worked with professionals who have said, I don't know how to improvise. You're the composer. You tell me what to play.
Yeah.
And so then you have to kind of overcome those inhibitions. Working with people in the community, depending on the age, I find young children have very little inhibition about it. Starting maybe around age 11 or 12, they start to get this idea of what a musician or a composer is. And they might think, and I've had some say to me, I don't know how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But then if you break it down into small steps, you can lead them through the process. And then at the end of it, they can look back and say, oh, well, we did this together, and be really, really excited and proud about what they were able to co-create. So I think that obviously the composer does have a role, and they do have important work to do.
Yes. Depending
on what your final goal is. If it's to create choral music, then you need accompaniment. If you're working with other professional musicians as well as the choir, you need to have scores.
Yes.
It sort of depends on what the people in the project need. And then the composer can help to create those things.
Yes.
So creating scores for people who need the scores, creating the accompaniment, filling in parts, sort of developing the piece, taking ideas and bringing options to the participants and saying, well, what about this? Or do you like this? Would you prefer this? There's lots and lots of different ways to do it.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
SIMM is the initiative of scholars and practitioners from 7 different countries and 4 different continents who felt the growing need to find ways to bring together people interested in developing research on the possible role music can play in social and community music programs. Sound engineer and co-editor of this episode of the SIMM-podcast is musician Mariusz Radwanski. Please visit our website at simm-platform.eu.
Cause